Okay, g'day, mate. 40 here. I'm back with the author, philosopher, Rony Guldmann. We talked a lot about his memoir, about his time in the Star Chamber at Stanford University. I'm a big fan of his magnum opus on conservative claims of cultural oppression. There's only one discordant note that I ever experienced, in particular in conservative claims of cultural oppression. That was the unduly respectful attitude that he took towards a book that I found ridiculous, Jonah Goldberg's 2008 book, Liberal Fascism. And so now we're going to revisit the entire topic of liberal fascism. So this was a book by Jonah that came out in 2008. The full title is Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the American Left from Mussolini to the Politics of Change. Rony, in your conservative claims of cultural oppression, you took this book with great seriousness. Why? Why initially with great seriousness?
Okay, well, I mean, first of all, I'm glad that, in a sense, though, even though I know you have criticisms of liberal fascism revisited, I'm glad that at least there's a sense in which maybe I'm rectifying, correctly or misguidedly, but nevertheless rectifying whatever errors or oversights I may have made in conservative claims of cultural oppression. So, I guess I wouldn't characterize it as unduly respectful. That is to say, I obviously I thought it was significant and worth discussing. Otherwise, I wouldn't have discussed it. Not necessarily for the accuracy of its specific claims, but because it embodied maybe not as brilliantly as one might have liked, but at least clearly the ethos of conservative claims of cultural oppression, namely the idea that there's been a some kind of big slander against conservatives, and he articulates it in a particular way, namely, as I highlight in the recent article, that conservatives have been tarred as proto-fascists. But in reality, all they are classical liberals. They want limited government, and they want these traditional values like don't have too much sex before you get married, work hard, accept deferred gratification, so on and so forth. So that was his definition of conservatism, and that's what I'm now saying. Of course, was never what really animated most conservatives, even though it maybe articulated, a portion of what they believe. But again, I was deferential with respect to what was relevant to my larger thesis, which is this project of exposing the left's characterizations of conservatives as somehow bigoted or prejudiced, parochial, sectarian, however you want to characterize that. In that respect, I think the book did embody a certain ethos, however one might criticize it, in other regards.
Right. And so you described it as poignant and self-conscious, written in response to the author's personal experience with the sublimely confident slanders of liberals. And I think it's fair to say that what Jonah did with liberal fascism is return the slander in kind. It was a work of his own emotional response, trying to think of like the nastiest thing that he can say to liberals in response to his life experience, feeling like he'd been continually slandered by liberals.
Yeah, you could say you could call it an exercise in petulance, if you like. But I think that it's not just his own personal exercise in petulance, even though it's, for all its intellectual flaws, it still articulated conservative sense that they've been somehow maligned or slandered by liberals. And I appreciated what you sent me about the tensions between conservative claims of cultural oppression and liberal fascism, and those indeed exist. But I was hoping to, and maybe this is what you're getting at, is that whatever rebuttal is appropriate to liberals, it's certainly more sophisticated than what Goldberg was able to articulate, which is kind of I know you are, but what am I? It's kind of what he's saying, and that's not satisfactory, obviously, for a host of reasons, which is I think what the new article articulates.
Now, Bill Buckley was also very similar to Jonah Goldberg in that showy, glib, performative, but largely intellectually vacuous. You would reference Buckley a little bit in Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression. Do you agree with me about the rather thin level of intellectual accomplishment in Bill Buckley's work?
I agree. I mean, that's my own personal impression. I mean, he is widely hailed by conservatives as a paragon of their creed, and I read God and Man at Yale. I mean, certainly if you're reading it in the 21st century, which is when I read it, it seems utterly trite. Of course, maybe that's an unfair impression because he was the one who kind of launched the entire train of criticisms. But I agree. If I was just watching him on a firing line or in other venues, I don't see him as some very dexterous analytical thinker. He has a certain sense of self-confidence which permeates all of his pronouncements. And I guess that's an expression of his socioeconomic background. He was Catholic, but nevertheless he kind of embodied the certitudes of a certain class of Americans and a certain class of conservatives during that period. And I would agree to the extent that he was seen as somehow profound. It was because he had that kind of social capital that allowed him to present himself that way. But in terms of analytical arguments, I don't consider him particularly sharp. I've certainly read, I would consider Goldberg to be sharper than him, and I've certainly read, conservative arguments that are sharper than anything he put forth. But I guess he was a man for the moment. I mean, that's again, given my position, I'm tempted to judge people by what I might consider to be impersonal intellectual standards. But however you might want to criticize them on that front is less than profound. In the moment he was in, he had whatever particular skill set was required to help initiate a certain kind of transformation. I guess in that regard, he was kind of like Trump. You could by graduate seminar standards, very woefully lacking. But in terms of what he set out to accomplish, maybe exactly what he needed.
I'm just thinking that much of the difference in the rhetorical style of the elite left and elite right is simply a matter of power position. So I remember when I became the editor of my high school newspaper, I was much less tolerant of disrespectful personal treatment by my friends within the newspaper room. That emerging as the leader of the high school newspaper, I expected to be treated as the leader of the high school newspaper in that particular context. And so I was just listening to Victor Davis Hanson from Stanford University talking about how now it's the left who are squares and fuddy-duddies. And I was just thinking, well, that's because they run the institutions. That when you run something, you don't have nearly as much freedom of expression. You have to worry about budgets and HR departments and legal challenges, and everything you say will then affect those downstream from you and horizontal institutions. And you just have to speak completely differently when you're in power. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head about the flamboyant, outrageous, campy style of the right-wing talkers, whether it's Bill Buckley, Jonah Goldberg, Milo Yiannopoulos, pretty much any right-wing talker is flamboyant and camp, as opposed to the Ezra Kleins and the seriousness of the people who dominate left-wing institutions. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head, certainly the left can be camp, the left can be fun, but when you're running an institution or you're in power, it completely changes your rhetorical style. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean that makes sense. I mean, the more you can hope to have some kind of actual influence, the more of an incentive you have to be technocratic. I guess, you know. I mean, I think there are some more serious conservatives in that. I like to listen to David Frum. Again, it's a very limited perspective, and certainly in terms of foreign policy. But I think there is some sort of an effort to be attuned to facts. But yeah, I mean, certainly that what you're talking about is the entire tension between the heritage media, the legacy media, and the internet, and the legacy media. It served a certain function. It was stayed in its way, very, very constrained, but it also kept out batshit crazy conspiracies, which is, I guess, what you would find with the Ezra Kleins and so forth. And now you have a democratic proliferation of voices through the internet, which everyone initially celebrated, but now you have to wonder, like, what is it really worth in the end? Sure, we want to be open-minded. We want to be, we want to question our assessment of, what's crazy and what's not. But on the other hand, that opens doors to a lot of performers and a lot of crazies. Milo Yiannopoulos was a great performer. I think, like, these days, let's say, Candace Owens, complete madness. She's being targeted by assassination by the French government. She believes with so it is a trade-off, and we have to adapt to it. I mean, the invention of the printing press led to a lot of craziness, and now we're not yet. I guess that was eventually resolved in a certain way. Namely, no one reads much anymore. But now we have the internet, and we will see if our species can adapt to that loss of constraints. I don't know.
So one way of understanding the current age is that we live in the attention economy, and the quickest and easiest way to get attention is by appealing to the most visceral of emotions. And I notice even with many fine intellects, they realize that outside of a sinecure at an NGO or a university, there's really no way to make a living through intellectual labor or via the pen with any serious work. You have to compete for attention. And liberal fascism is certainly a cry for attention. And frankly, a good deal of the books that you cite in conservative claims of cultural oppression are competing in the attention economy by trying to make their claims as visceral as possible. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Goldberg, even though, he has acknowledged that the book was wrong only in the most limited and arguably disingenuous of manners, namely, he had overestimated conservatives' moral moral strength, their willingness to succumb to fascist temptation, but that otherwise, you know, he was correct, but for that, you know, conceitedly big assumption, but he was incorrect in other ways. You know, there was a certain sensationalism. Now, you know, as you know, and you know, you discuss the tensions between conservative claims and liberal fascism, and certainly, you know, when I critique liberalism and conservative claims of cultural repression, you know, I do critique a certain fraudulent neutrality and a tendency to underestimate the actual, you know, long-term costs of liberalism to certain people. But you know, those kinds of criticisms, you know, they stand on their own. I don't adduce them to, you know, support the conclusion that liberals are really fascists. Even though I do see some Goldberg as an example of conservatives attempt to articulate that you know, a certain rhetorical injustice. But you know, I write in this is like towards the end of the article, and I say that, you know, in rejecting Goldberg's claims, I'm not saying that every conservative is you know, destined to become fascist or anything like that. But let me just recall what I'm thinking. But that there is a certain impulse that has to be given expression in a certain way, a certain desire to avenge yourself on those who control the commanding heights of the culture, which is Goldberg's expression. And he, you know, he achieves that revenge, you know, through his book, through the hyperbole and arguable histrionics of liberal fascism, which is, you know, his like literary privilege. But you have, you know, insofar as you know, a lot of conservatives have become more authoritarian. That's because, you know, for them to act on the grievances which he highlighted, that book is not enough. It was enough for Goldberg as an author, but for them as American citizens, you know, they feel a need to you know, upend the present order in an authoritarian direction, however you want to characterize that. And so, you know, yeah, Goldberg's book is a kind of exercise in privilege. I guess the privilege of the conservative intellectual.
So it's so important to place literary works and in their proper genre, and conservative claims of cultural oppression, you bend over backwards to understand and to articulate the experience of life of people who are generally foreign to you politically.
Right.
Now, this work on revisiting the book Liberal Fascism is a different type of work. It's not explanatory. It's not participatory intellectual journey into understanding the experience of the enemy camp. It is, I mean, it strikes me as a work of polemics. Is that fair?
I think for me, it has a polemical aspect. Relative to conservative claims of cultural oppression, yes. It's polemical. I think, you know, relative to the average standard liberal critique of the right, I think it's nuanced. So, you know, what is it relative to? You know, I've certainly, you know, there are tensions, and I agree. It's polemical insofar as a lot of the claims, you know, do admit of greater nuance. But again, you know, my experience. Well, let me put it this way. You might recall in the Star Chamber of Stanford that at a certain point when, you know, Joe and Barbara were completely exasperated with me. Okay, you know, we know you're onto something interesting, but there's a lack of definitiveness there. And so why don't you just like conclude the article by responding to what you've written thus far with the the liberal refutation of what you've written, and I rejected that. Not that there wasn't a liberal perspective, but I felt that I had to at least develop my understanding of the conservative one much more before I could legitimately critique it. So I see this article as maybe a belated, like much of my life is belated, response to that suggestion, right? The liberal perspective, and it is in certain regards polemical, but I'm not. I'd like to think that it is, as to the ultimate question of whether conservatives are genuinely culturally oppressed by the left. I'd like to think that the article leaves it an open question. That is to say, whether you consider this to be genuine or not, if it is your premise, then you can see how you would come to endorse certain authoritarian measures. And I've been working on it since the version I sent you a couple weeks ago, and I still need to hammer some of these things out. So yeah, it's more polemical than the manuscript. That's for sure. But I still try to keep the polemicism, bounded. If I say I'm going to articulate every possible nuance, like at least with my personality, that ended up leading to everything that I wrote about at Stanford and the 700-page conservative claims of cultural oppression. I was trying to create something more compact, which was going to be by its nature was going to be intellectually unfair in certain regards, right? I hope to limit that in a way that's commensurate with my objective.
Right. I feel like you have such a special opportunity to be able to articulate each side to the other right now, that there are so few people who can do that one can make a genuine, powerful case for why the non-Trump voting side of America has genuine fear and concern and feels oppressed. And there are so many examples that would build that case. And even though that's not my side of the political spectrum, I absolutely think it can be done. And also at the same time, one can build the case for Trump and MAGA and the experience of those who support him, seeing, yes, we've won another election, but we feel that almost all the institutions are tilted against us. And so if we have to bully them back towards the center, that's the price that we're willing to take. But ever since Trump took office his second term, you've seemingly only seen fascism coming from the White House.
I mean, in a sense, these are not. So, first of all, as to this point, is like we have to, and I said earlier that I was revising the work, trying to make it more nuanced, and I since after I sent you the version that I sent, I've developed a section where I say that if you look at the Trump administration's treatment of universities, major law firms, major media, from the perspective of the left, it's outrageously authoritarian. But I write that from the perspective of MAGA, it's no more authoritarian than the various economic interventions by the left, or which the left would ideally implement, meaning the left implements these interventions with the hope of rectifying this kind of background socioeconomic inequality. And, conservatives will back Trump's attacks on the elites in universities, law firms, media, etc., using the same justification in the name of government intervention for the sake of some kind of equality, namely, the elites have just permeated all the commanding heights of the culture, as Goldberg said, and nothing short of some sort of heavy-handed moves like conditioning, federal funding on reforms or so forth, will do. So yeah, I think this effort to what is understood to rectify a certain inequality, it has to be is certainly part of the picture, and it wasn't in the version I sent you. But I think I've addressed that most recently.
So, what prompted you in the first place to revisit liberal fascism, or have you already addressed that? What prompted you to revisit the book Liberal Fascism?
Well, I just had this intuition that, again, my problem, from early on is, everyone is saying, yourself included, like, oh yeah, in conservative claims of cultural oppression, you have all these like fascinating arguments, but how do you relate those to somebody who isn't interested in reading all of that? How do you have to capture people's attention and persuade them much sooner than the end of this long ass manuscript. And I thought that going back and looking at liberal fascism might be an effective way, and might create an effective forum for me to communicate some of what I've been arguing, in a more academic format before, and hopefully in a somewhat less academic format through the revisiting of the book.
So when did you start thinking of the Republican Party as turning fascist? When did that happen? Was it January 20th of this year?
No, I mean, I certainly, January 6th, even though a great many Republicans were very hostile to it, and, initially, they gradually, forgave it and almost supported it later. So those were the earliest harbingers. But, I think that, not that, anyone who disputes the ACLU's vision of civil liberties, not that necessarily makes you fascist, but I think about things like, there was, an assault on this apartment building in the south side of Chicago, people being arrested middle of the night. You've got, as I try to emphasize, if you're intellectually honest and you see, or directives to fire various employees or CEOs, if you're honest, you just put aside all the theories, and you just look at the phenomena and you say, like, what in the 20th century does this kind of stuff remind you of? I don't see how you can say anything other than European fascism. Now, again, one thing I try to emphasize in the article is that I'm not a scholar of fascism. I'm not trying to argue for some precise definition of fascism. I'm sure I don't have one, and any such definition would certainly be open to contestation. But still, we have a general idea of what kinds of things are fascist-like, and certainly what the Trump administration was doing on all sorts of levels certainly resemble that, whether it be through the colloquial, imagery of fascism or Goldberg's own definitions. There was, the resemblance was so strong that you had to go back and say, obviously Goldberg was wrong. It did not come from the left; it came from the right. Now, again, that doesn't preclude various critiques of the left in terms of a fraudulent neutrality and other things. But insofar as we want to use the term fascism, clearly conservatives, the president's positions of many or most conservatives are clearly reminiscent of that, more so than anything we've seen in the American political scene.
Well, so the two examples you just gave were arrests in the middle of the night and arrests at an apartment building in Chicago. Neither of those are distinctively fascist.
No, but you have other things. I mean, yeah, I mean, you could imagine, again, as I say, I don't claim to know exactly where you draw the line between authoritarian and fascist, but certainly you have sort of this otherization. There are these other people who are like by and large pernicious. You have Trump as the great leader, the veneration of Trump. Trump wants to put his name on put his head on a coin. Have an arch erected in his name. Again, there's any one thing that he did, any single thing you could say could also arise in a non-fascist context. But when you put it all together, when you look at both the actual legal measures taken and the sort of the tropes used, you put it all together. There's an unmistakable affinity. Again, I don't think that there are differences. Okay, it is America, so you're not going to have anything like a Hitler Youth. You're never going to have this ideal of like total militarization of civilian life or total subordination of the individual will to the leader, the future of the race. There are certainly those differences, but when even after acknowledging all that, I think the similarities are noteworthy.
Well, you just added otherization, the cult of the great leader, naming public buildings after the leader, and venerating the leader. All of those were true for Barack Obama, John F. Kennedy, Bill Clinton, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, again, I just don't find anything remotely fascist in any of these markers. What's different in the veneration of Donald Trump from the veneration of Barack Obama by his team?
Well, I mean, again, I don't know if it's in the version that I sent you, but if not, I read it soon thereafter, and I said, yes, certainly many liberals that may have had a certain irrational exuberance over Obama's prospects of a transformative leader, but it's not, it's not the sacralization that one sees of Trump. So first of all, you have, I don't know what exact percentage of Trump supporters this constitutes. I don't think it's negligible. But you had Steve Bannon say only a few weeks ago that Trump is a vehicle of divine providence. I don't think anyone said that of Obama or any other Democrats you mentioned, and many certainly believe it. I also think that you can say, well, they also revered Obama and so forth. People revere Trump, but even if you want to characterize their attitude towards Obama and so forth as reverence, the reverence in the case of Trump was reverence in the face of so much, completely outrageous behavior that in any other administration would be considered completely outrageous, from, claiming that, they were saving 25,000 American lives for each, Caribbean drug boat they were blowing up, increasing tariffs on Canada because he didn't like an ad. The list goes on and on. So, even if you want to say like the reverence towards Obama was somehow similar to that towards Trump, the reverence towards Trump is in the face of all sorts of outrages. Again, people often say on YouTube, like, can you imagine? Do you have a duty to obey the Constitution? Trump said, I'm not sure. It was never an issue. Had Obama said anything like that, it would have sparked months of outrage among conservatives, or consider all the attempted deployments of the National Guard and military in various cities. So towards the end of the Obama administration, there was Operation Jade Helm, which was simply a series of military exercises where various military units traveled from state to state to effectuate these exercises. And in the eyes of conservatives, this was incipient fascism. Obama is priming the military to take over, to put conservatives into camps. Meanwhile, you have actual military mobilizations by Trump, and it's no big deal. So I feel that for anything Trump does, can you find sort of the seed of that, the very beginnings of that, in the attitudes of various Democrats? Maybe you can, but that goes to sort of a larger criticism of like Trump supporters, which is that any criticism one might have of Trump, how can he, his personal values and conduct is completely inconsistent with these professions to, Christianity or traditional values. And, the response is, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And so we have these conservatives who are, highly, highly moralistic in other contexts. When it comes to Trump, it's, he who is without sin cast the first stone. So I think there is both a quantitative and qualitative difference between Trump and various Democrats. Not to say that Trump, you can say Roosevelt was heavy-handed in certain ways, but then again he was responding to a real crisis, namely the Great Depression. Whereas, for Trump, every time, a National Guardsman gets shot or whatever, it's a national emergency that may call for martial law. In the case of Trump, these were all fabricated, emergencies. Just like I wrote with, in the article, Biden, might have crossed certain constitutional lines in the pressure exerted by federal agencies on social media to police anti-vaccine voices, perhaps, but then again, if you're telling people that these vaccines will magnetize you or implant you with microchips, there's a certain craziness, and I can see why the government might legitimately want to taper down on that. Whereas, again, there are limits to that, and maybe it was unconstitutional. I haven't thought about it enough to say one way or the other, but maybe it was. Whereas with like Trump, it's just his own ego. This comedian is mocking me. That's why he needs to be stopped. There's no even arguable public interest behind it. So I agree that no one is without sin, but I still discern some very real differences.
So in your essay, you claim that MAGA reveals the latent authoritarian impulses inside American conservatism. I expect every political movement to contain authoritarian impulses, and it will depend on the particular situation whether or not they become explicit. But do you think that danger essentially lurks on the right compared to other political movements?
I wouldn't say that as a general universal matter. I wouldn't even say that as a universal truth as to the West, but as to America generally, I think it's true. So one could critique what I've written and say, okay, any set of values can have cancerous authoritarian outgrowths. So there's a legitimate desire for some sort of stable communal culture, and yes, that can transmogrify into authoritarianism, and that's bad. But you could say, liberal left-wing commitments to equality can do so as well. And I think that's true as a general matter. I mean, certainly if you look at the Soviet Union or Mao, the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, you can find lots of examples where a facially unobjectionable idea like equality leads to some pretty terrible things. And conservatives can say, likewise, our belief in traditional values, that can have certain authoritarian outgrowths, but that's a function of any kind of serious moral commitments. And I think that's probably true broadly speaking, but in the American context, in the context of America and Western Europe post World War II, I think you'll find that these conservative, warning cries that the welfare state is the road to serfdom, just have not been borne out. Again, if you look at certain more primitive agrarian societies, revolutionary Russia, revolutionary China, there's this huge amount of resentment against these aristocratic classes that have trampled the workers and the peasantry underfoot for centuries. There you bring out this kind of universalistic ideal of equality. Yeah, that can lead to some terrible things. But that hasn't been the case in the Atlantic nations of Western Europe and America post World War II. And likewise, I mean, things like violence. I mean, probably in the late 60s, early 70s, there's probably a period where the left was at least as violent and terroristic as the right, maybe more so, maybe much more so. I'm not sure. But if you look at the context of modern America, it's right wing passions that as it happens are more likely to lead to violence and murder. So universally, I agree. Any ideology is susceptible to that. But in the context which concerns the article, I think there's something different about the right.
You should read this book, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, which essentially points out that notions of things like freedom and authoritarianism and murder depend upon the perspective of the observer. And so if you, for example, have a traditional Christian hero system where abortion is regarded as murder, then the legalization of abortion is the most murderous act ever carried out by the American government. That's not my hero system, but I recognize that if that is one's hero system, then the legalization of abortion is the most murderous thing carried out by the American government. So when we talk about authoritarianism and loss of freedom and this and that is cancerous, it just seems, based on what I learned from your book, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, entirely depends upon the nature of one's hero system, which is subjective. And so if you have one particular hero system, then the Democrats are the greatest threat to freedom and the most likely to be cancerous and oppressive. And if you have a different hero system, then Republicans are the biggest threat. And there's no objective definition of bad authoritarianism. I mean, you could say that Abraham Lincoln was fascist because he did away with habeas corpus.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that, and again, as I said, I think the version I sent you is not quite yet the right articulation of what I want to say, and whether it's in there or in like subsequent versions, I don't want my argument in the article to be seen as premised on the idea that, of course, the left can't be authoritarianism given the inherent nature of the left. And I think that at various points, I acknowledge that the left may be more authoritarian that its self-presentation openly acknowledges. But still, there is a difference between that, which conservative claims talks about at length, and the phenomenon of fascism, which that's certainly a narrower concept than, let's say, having a fraudulent neutrality. Like the fact that the neutrality of the left and liberalism may be fraudulent at a certain level doesn't mean necessarily, it doesn't follow from that they are, just as fascist as significant swaths of the American right. So, I guess, yeah, if one uses fascism as just a synonym for anything that departs from the lofty ideal of lofty and unreal ideal of liberal neutrality, then yeah, they are just a fascist. But I think that in the context of this article at least, I think fascists have, whatever it means exactly, it has a narrower sense than, a general, parochialism or sectarianism. And I think that when you look at that specifically, that can be more associated with the right.
So there's a bloke, Bruce Kuklick, who a couple of years ago published a book, Fascism Comes to America, A Century of Obsession in Politics and Culture. And it is kind of funny how often the word fascist is thrown around in American political discourse to talk about American politicians. This author concluded that in the American context, fascist has become little more than a political swear word. It is a term of contempt rather than a precise analytic category. And it doesn't so much refer to anything that exists as much as it accomplishes disapproval. What do you think of that analysis?
Look, yeah, I mean, there's no question. I'm not disputing that, over the years, and this is really a lot of what Goldberg is reacting to. Yes, okay, there's a certain breed of leftist or liberal that will describe anything that falls short of their particular universalism as, fascist, okay? Or, you make the observation that, there are, blacks have higher per capita crime rates than whites, let's say. That's racist. You want, stronger criminal sentencing, they'll say it's fascist. Okay, that is there, but and you can say, okay, the boy cried wolf. Nice crying wolf again. You can say, okay, you're not crazy to say I'm not going to take it that seriously. That's not crazy, but it's also not crazy to say that yes, even though the boy cried wolf many times, it's still possible that the wolf has actually arrived, as it does in the fable, and that's why I think I'm careful when I in section 2 of the article to distance my comparisons from these kind of glib accusations that anything that falls short of liberal ideals is fascist. So I'm not saying that the Trump administration is racist, for example, merely because it opposes quotas or affirmative action, or merely because it doesn't center the all importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But when you go out of your way to scrub Pentagon websites of black war heroes, when you on DHS ICE recruitment ads, you make a reference to Which Way Western Man, which is an obvious allusion to Which Way Which Way American Man, which is an allusion to Which Way Western Man, a neo-Nazi tract. I think you can I do hold myself to a higher standard than these glib leftists, but I think you can find certain things that are indisputable. Or the Coast Guard recently, it declassified swastikas and nooses as hate symbols, saying, yeah, they were maybe controversial symbols, but not necessarily hate symbols. Okay, we can debate whether the Coast Guard should be classifying symbols in the first place, but given that they were, what's the impetus from that? That is that you can rightly suspect that some of these fascist, racist passions are a play. I distinguish that from sort of the lazy aspersions, which is anyone that's slightly to the left of me is a fascist. That laziness is there, but again, just because they cried wolf doesn't mean.
Okay, I won't have you repeat. So what you're articulating reminds me of National Review and its attitude for decades that essentially communism and liberalism both came from the same place, the Enlightenment, that they're both all about equality. Communists were more willing to use force. Liberals wanted to use politics. You could call communism hard socialism, and liberalism was simply soft socialists. So you have kind of a mirror image to what you're talking about on the right that looks at a welfare state as incipient communism. So both sides of the political spectrum express things often in a hyperbolic tone.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, what animates me in the article is not the hyperbole or the tenor, which is just like part of life, with the onset of the culture wars, but actual legal measures, which I find to be quite dangerous. Seizing on everything is an emergency that requires emergency powers. I see actual changes in precedents and the kinds of restrictions and limitations to which the government is set. So I think that's a real thing, even if the hyperbole and the histrionics are a constant on all sides. There's a real change there.
I'll just switch topics just for a little lighten the mood briefly.
Sure.
James Burnham was a key editor at National Review, and he would say privately very different things than he'd say publicly. There's one area where I've noticed the leading conservative intellectuals speak very differently privately than they do publicly. So publicly, they're all about being colorblind.
Right.
Privately, not so much. So privately, they'll talk about black-white tensions will destroy this country, but publicly, they're all about the colorblind, and privately, the things that they will say frequently about blacks, much less often about Jews, though. I'm sure it's true on the left. I just don't know as many leading left-wing intellectuals, but though I do remember some of my university professors would say very different things about race privately than publicly. So I guess one way that this connects is that the public presentation of a political orientation is very different from how people truly think and feel. That all players in politics say things that they don't believe, and I notice that on the right, the most dramatic difference is in matters of race. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I agree, and I think that's my critique of Goldberg largely revolves around that kind of observation. He has this very idealized idea of this is what conservatism is. And insofar as there's any deviation from that, he's just going to say, well, people aren't perfect. We're all flawed. But yeah, he has this definition of conservatism, which is at odds with how conservatives think we should actually understand social and cultural movements, which is we need to look not at their idealized, theorized self-conception, but look at the real life emotions that animate them, and they will they'll apply that to Marxism, that say, yeah, on its face you're committed to these lofty ideals of human equality, but really, you're an underemployed elite with a failed bourgeois with all these resentments. So they will, when they look at the left, they will certainly distinguish between the lofty self-conception and the murkier emotions undergirding that, which Goldberg certainly does. But that is at least as applicable to the right, and Eisenhower was, I guess, relatively progressive for a Republican of his time, but I think it was well known that he would speak the N-word on the golf course, or
as
whatever.
would plenty of Democrats, right?
I'm sure as well. Well, certainly the Southern Democrats,
right.
Probably beyond the golf course for the Southern ones, But Eisenhower was sort of a symbol of the American middle. And there you can really see the discrepancy. So I think that even though I agree that the article is not as ecumenical as the book, I think that one thing that I and even more Trump favorable conservatives can agree on is that this Goldberg's construction of conservatism as this very ethereal commitment to limited government, individual rights, and these sort of anodyne traditional values like deferred gratification is not ultimately what conservatives claim care more about. I'm sure they care about different things, but whatever their vision is, it's certainly more robust than what Goldberg articulates, and therefore we have a sort of a common interest in saying that this is just a veneer. Whatever your stance towards it, it was never what it was really all about.
So I'll just lighten the mood with another anecdote. So there's a podcast about Israel that I listen to regularly. It's called Call Me Back with Dan Senor. And it's
yes.
Okay. And so he
the startup nation guy, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so his podcast has just become must listening for Zionists like myself. And I'll never forget, he gave a talk at the 92nd Street Y about the state of world Jewry. And he talks about how there was an incident on a New York subway train where someone stood up and said, if you're a Zionist, raise your hand. And everyone was too cowed, or maybe there was no Zionist in the subway car. And Dan Senor says that he thinks about that incident every single day. I mean, what a trauma. And I'm thinking, if that's your example of trauma, you have an unbelievably sheltered life. You are just so unbelievably blessed that if you think of that as some major trauma, it just shows how spoiled you are. So anyway, Dan Senor was part of an event with a Jewish foundation, the Tikva Foundation, with Ben Shapiro and Barry Weiss, and it was all against grievance politics, while at the same time it was all about how Jewish grievance politics is the only way to go. So these guys just pathologize Christian male claims of victimhood, Christians who feel victimized, men who feel that masculinity is put down, white people who feel pushed down by DEI and BLM. Right, they're a bunch of losers if they want to buy into this victimhood story. But Jews have a victimhood story, and not only is it not pathological, it's sacred. It's the only way to go. These are the people who've truly suffered, and all right-thinking people should be Zionist and pro-Israel and supporting Jewish day schools. And it's just hilarious to hear these denunciations of grievance politics by people trafficking in grievance politics. I don't denounce grievance politics. I think it's just an inherent part of life. And I think I didn't learn it from your book. I learned it before that. But anytime you have a strong in-group identity, you always carry along with you a strong sense of grievance and a strong sense of victimhood. And whenever you have a strong sense of grievance and victimhood, you think all sorts of horrible things about outgroups. And this isn't something that's unique to Jews or Zionists or people on the right or people on the left or black people or gays. Or like, this is just a universal nature of human arrangements. Strong in-group identity means you have a strong sense of victimhood, and grievance politics is just the nature of reality. There's nothing uniquely fascist or communist about it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess as to Shapiro, I mean, I don't know that he's been. I mean, you might find individuals that meet your description, but as to Ben Shapiro, I don't know that he's been, dismissive of white or white grievance politics. I mean, you can certainly find some very Zionist liberals who have been, and there's definitely a marked inconsistency as you've described. I'm not sure about Shapiro himself, whether that criticism is how much it applies to him. But no, I mean, I certainly agree, and it is sort of insufferable. I mean, to me, to listen to a Shapiro or Barry Weiss complain about Arab anti-Semitism when you have you've got tons of Israeli parents who are happy to go to the streets with their children and chant death to the Arabs. Like any kind of national conflict, you're gonna find these kinds of unfair racial like stereotypes of each other. That's just inherent to the conflict. It's nothing special. There's certainly no strong history of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. Certainly, it's always historically been much less powerful than in Europe. So yeah, there is. I don't like Ben Shapiro or Barry Weiss either. I guess I would say.
But I think you'd agree with me that grievance politics is politics. That anyone who cares about politics is going to have a grievance.
Yeah, for sure, and that's that. I agree, and I think that if you, my attack on liberal fascism is precisely that Goldberg misassessed the relative importance of grievance politics versus these, abstract conservative theorizations about the good society. And he insisted that the conservative movement, it's really all about these abstract theorizations. And that was the premise of his book, and why he said, well, conservatives couldn't really be fascists and liberals are more so. But if you look beneath that, if you say really all of this is really about grievance, at least as primordially, more primordially than principles, then you can understand the conservative movement's fascist turn in the way that you couldn't if you didn't recognize the centrality of grievance.
Now, is there anything essential about the left and right, or even the left and right in America? Because for many decades, Republicans were the pro-black party. For many decades, Republicans were the pro-establishment party. For many decades, Republicans were the pro-institution party, the pro-military and law enforcement party. But when that became inconvenient, of course, Republicans switched. That Democrats and liberals portray themselves as the autonomy and freedom party. Women get to choose what they do with their own body, except when it comes to vaccines and 20 other things. And I'm quite skeptical that there's any essence to the left and right, or there are some predispositions that show themselves very differently in different situations. What do you think?
Okay, so certainly, so first of all, we want to distinguish between the essence of left and right versus the essence of the Republican and Democratic Party. So as to the latter, yes, certainly these are extremely fluid and malleable, and over the long haul, yeah, it might be very hard to chart any through line between within the parties. Now, when it comes to what we call conservatism on the one hand and versus liberalism / progressivism on the other hand, that presents a more complicated question. Certainly, if you were to take somebody whom we might describe as left of center in the 18th century, they certainly would be very far from being able to understand or endorse much that the left believes in the 20th century. So obviously what it means to be left-wing, that is certainly relevant, relative to sort of your historical position. But let's sort of go beyond that, beyond the fact that the left will only push the envelope so far. Is there, what does it mean to be right or left? I mean, the original right or left came from the National Assembly during the French Revolution. You had on the left side were the Jacobins, the most radical, and towards the right were the people who wanted less of a radical change, maybe a constitutional monarchy rather than a republic. So how do you conceptualize that difference? Well, you can think in terms of the old versus the new, but that doesn't necessarily make much sense because you have today, I mean, what if, I think that seems like a shallow way of conceptualizing left and right, is that, a belief in unthinking forms of hierarchy versus Enlightenment criticism of inherited concepts. You could also conceptualize left and right in that way, and I think that still has some kind of meaning. Wokeness is certainly left wing in that respect, and it's like a desire to, for better or worse, tear apart old categories. So, there might still be like an overall left-right distinction that still makes sense on some level.
Yeah, but it's hard to think of specific areas of essence. So, let's say gay marriage. Many Republicans would say, "Oh, gay marriage, it's the most conservative thing possible. It's two people committing themselves to each other." Or
right.
The civil rights agenda of Martin Luther King. That's the very embodiment of American conservatism. And I mean, anything you take, respect for law enforcement. Not a whole lot of respect for law enforcement when law enforcement was opposed to MAGA rioters. So
right.
So MAGA and the Republicans have become quite hostile to the FBI, the CIA, to the woke manifestations of the military. It starts to verge on the impossible to find any essential concrete difference between the parties. What you do have is a predispositional orientation that manifests itself very differently in different situations. So for a while, free trade was more identified with the left part of the spectrum, and then it was more identified with the right side of the spectrum, and now that's been turned upside down. Government spending, there's probably been more limits on government spending rhetoric from Republicans, but not much difference in practice. So it verges on the impossible, finding essential clear-cut differences between left and right, just in the American political spectrum between conservatism and liberalism. Like, name me something: civil rights, or marginal tax rates, or gay marriage. I mean, whatever you can find is probably being the opposite 40 years ago.
Well, I guess is on some things that's probably the case, but in terms of, for instance, support, being willing to, tax the upper echelons of society more greatly in order to fund some sort of welfare state that sort of subsidizes various goods and services that are deemed, essential. I mean, I think that that versus the right's rejection of that, I think that remains as meaningful today.
But it wasn't true under Eisenhower and Nixon. They were fine with 90% tax rates on the rich to fund the welfare state.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, if you're talking about sort of the pre Goldwater, pre Nixon moderate conservative party of the 1950s. Sure, I mean, some would say like they were Republicans, but they weren't necessarily conservatives. Maybe not liberals, but moderates. But I think that if you were to look from the beginnings of the conservative movement in the 70s and certainly in Reagan, that through line that remains the case. That's been over 40 years. Right. That has, I don't think that has changed.
Right. That hasn't changed since the 70s, but it wasn't there prior to the 70s, and it is changing now. In this term, Trump was considering raising taxes on marginal rates on the rich because the situation is different. Mm-hmm.
It wasn't in the public eye, but even from the 1930s onward, you still had all these resentful oligarchs and plutocrats who pined for the halcyon days of the 1920s or earlier the Gilded Age, and saying all these socialistic reforms are an affront to America, and they had very little social power until we had the Powell memo and then Reagan, and then they reemerged. But the fundamental opposition was still there. It's just that one side was extremely weak for a protracted period of time. But I think people could still differentiate between what was more right wing and what was more left wing, even if the real right wing had a marginal place. I think the conceptual distinction still held.
So do you think that conservatism and liberalism in America in the last 50 years, are these more coherent moral philosophies, or are they more patchworks of justifications created to serve allies and to fight rivals?
They are patchworks, but I don't think they're as they're cynically calculated to achieve certain ends. I mean, they might be in certain contexts with certain coalitions, but I think they're patchworks which are attempting to reconcile a range of political temperaments or moral temperaments, and trying to kind of put them together. So for example, in the areas where I kind of in the piece, I say no, conservatism isn't fascism, but the psychological dispositions that sustain conservatism can, under certain circumstances, give rise to fascism. And so there would be again this sense of being oppressed by some sort of foreign interloper, and you can conceptualize that in many different ways, and they're not all conspiratorial necessarily, and they're not all fascist, but it's what brings together people who have a certain kind of visceral sense of the world, even if the doctrinal articulations of that sense vary greatly in incompatible ways. And you can probably find something similar on the left as well. So they are patchworks. They certainly don't rise to strict logical coherence. But I think I don't think they're cynically motivated necessarily.
No, they're just self-interested. They're not driven by any deep commitments to any principle whatsoever. They're driven by group loyalty and what is self-serving for their group, whether that's known consciously or not.
Yeah, but also a desire to find there is that, but also maybe a desire to find a shared ethos across groups, which is what I strive to articulate. Maybe that might not hold its own in the face of bona fide conflicts of interest. But I think it's part of the glue, I think.
So have you ever heard of a bloke named Stefan Molyneux?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so he runs a group that he bills as the largest philosophical community in the world. And he believes that anyone who supports any type of government beyond the strictly libertarian is someone who wants to see you shot and killed, because all taxation in the final analysis is backed by the power of the U.S. government. So if you support social welfare spending, if you support anything beyond the most minimum of taxation, you are someone who violates the non-aggression principle. And he advocates people should cut ties with anyone who doesn't support the non-aggression principle. And so supporting Social Security and Medicare, these are all people who depend on the power of the state to throw people in prison, and if they resist, to shoot them. And so I guess I agree with Stefan to the extent that any type of politics is finally backed up by the use of force.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, but I mean, even in the real world, like you don't pay your taxes. Yeah, it's backed up by the use of force, but they're not. I mean, very often, you'll just have to pay a big fine. I mean, they're not.
But if you resist the fine, in his way of thinking, the state is entitled to use force against you, and so in the final analysis,
they'll put a lien on your bank account.
Well, no, they're going to arrest you if you don't pay. They're not going to just put liens. They're going to arrest you. They're going to take you down with force, and if you resist, right, they will keep escalating the force.
I guess. I mean, yeah. I mean, supposedly anybody could. Resisting the law could put law enforcement in a position where they had no resort but the use of lethal force. I suppose it's always possible to put that in their position, but I think he's kind of there's. It seems to me like there's like two moves going on with Molyneux. Like, first of all, there's a certain slippery slope reasoning that sort of human beings are incapable of exercising reasonable judgment as to how far the welfare state should go. That once you take a simple step down that way, you're no different from a Stalinist secret police killing the kulaks or whatever. And then two. This thing, which I think probably reflects something about his own psychology, this desire to like impute this into other people, that that because they endorse some measure of state coercion beyond what he would acknowledge, and therefore there's this incipient intent to destroy all those who disagree, even though there's not in the real world. I mean, that seems a little pathological to me.
He's right to the extent that all law in the final analysis is backed by the power of force. So,
I guess.
But it seems to be also essentially what you're arguing, that given everything that the Trump administration either legislates or decrees, it's going to be backed by the power of force, which makes politics so visceral, because in the final analysis, it's the government that claims the exclusive right to keep escalating force until people submit.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is what has struck me, especially when you look at ICE, a use of force which is completely lawless and unrestrained, and very little can be done. I mean, you have the courts, but it's cumbersome and slow. That's what I guess what struck me as fascist, the use of violence that seemed very unconstrained by any kind of principle. Yeah.
Well, isn't it naive to think that there are principles that are animating politics? That's just kind of the discussion we've been having the last 20 minutes. It's not principle that animates politics. It's essentially our evolutionary tribal predispositions to try to create alliances to further our own interests.
Yeah, well, it doesn't. Principle doesn't animate the id of politics, but you know that id, that sense of self interest, it has to become acclimatized to a certain system, and that's where the principles operate. So, you know, maybe the principles don't motivate, but they do constrain, and that's good enough.
As a UCLA psychologist, David Pinsoff, who has a terrific blog called Everything is Bullshit, and he boils things down very simply. If something doesn't have a reproductive evolutionary advantage, it's bullshit. So, for example, caring about a different group on the other side of the world, that's you must be playing a status game or something going on, because there'd be no evolutionary advantage to care about that. And I just think it's a wonderful way to boil things down, because in the final analysis, politics is another self-interested collective action that people engage in niche construction, right? Every type of life is trying to change its environment to better suit it. And that's true for Republicans, for Democrats, for communists, for fascists, for pond scum to snails to sharks to snakes to kangaroos. Everything is trying to change the niche around it to suit it. And Trump is doing it, and Obama does it. Everyone is trying to shape the niche and trying to gain the levers of power by making alliances. And then the arguments that people put forward for their alliances usually bear no resemblance to what's truly motivating them.
Yeah, well, you know, it's like when I talk about the amygdala theory of conservatism in the article. So we all, I mean, you know, we're all evolved from these primitive creatures, and that part of our nervous system, which first developed under those conditions, is still with us, like pressing us on, and we have these overlays which, you know, to various extents, restrict or channel or restrain these primitive instincts, but only so far. You know, you can certainly can't put them out of play. So, you know, that is the human condition. And I think someone like Trump, you know, how could he, you know, look at himself in the mirror without, you know, any kind of principles, without any kind of, you know, no recrimination, no guilt for being, you know, 100% purely self-interested? Well, because he, just like you said, he fixates on that part of our brain, and so he's saying, at the end of the day, we're all the same at that level. However differently we may express it or act, we're all basically the same. So there's nothing special to criticize about me. But if everybody thought like that, then we would lose these second order constraints, which you know, channel these older evolutionary drives in a way that's ultimately more productive. So that kind of, you know, yeah, you can say there's a certain realism, a certain truth telling to that. But if everybody is realistic in that manner, we'll be worse off.
So Jonah Goldberg and his ilk parted ways with Donald Trump and the Republican Party many years ago, because they found that the new Republicans were not principled conservatives. And I mean, it's just so funny to me, because Jonah Goldberg, from his work, has no self-evident principles. It's just like glib, shallow nonsense. But there is this dedicated group out there, principled conservatives, who must part ways with the new direction of the Republican Party. How do you understand these principled conservatives?
Well, I mean, yeah, no, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, obviously, Trump is a sort of chaotic and unprincipled in a host of ways, but the MAGA movement, you know, it is a contemporary iteration of a form of American conservatism that's older than Goldberg's form. You know, the Buchananite, the more isolationist, less cosmopolitan, in some respects more anti-Semitic form of conservatism, less committed to the free market. That was that was always there, and it was disempowered, beginning with Buckley, suppressing the John Birch Society, or really not really the John Birch, its leader, Robert Welch, and saying, we're sort of something different, we're more cosmopolitan. But the fact that to say like they have, they are the real authentic conservatism, and these others are these interlopers just bandying the label. I agree that's certainly false, because all the currents that MAGA expresses in an arguably chaotic fashion have always been there in America. They're real, they're true, they're authentic, they're certainly conservative in their way. So
there's never been a principled conservatism. Like, name me anyone who's like an embodiment of principled conservatism, and I'd find the same human foibles in their work that you find with anyone else.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're no more. Again, I think like principled conservative. It's, even Edmund Burke and a lot of conservatives were skeptical of principles, saying we have to just exercise sound judgment. That's what conservatism is about. It's about being able to exercise sound judgment without reliance on abstractions like principles. I think that for Goldberg, the reason that assumes center stage is because again they're trying to make conservatism respectable, as kind of liberal in its way, as part of the conversation of the American center. And so things like principles like the free market and so forth, I think they probably highlighted that in order to better to make themselves palatable in a way that wasn't true either to the sentiments of a lot of conservatives or to conservative theory like that in Edmund Burke, which was suspicious of principles.
It sounds like the court Jew, right? The court Jew was someone who was assimilated to the norms of a court and who would represent Jews at court by behaving in the way that was expected for someone at court. And people like Jonah Goldberg, they're like court conservatives. They will represent their people in the institutions controlled by the left.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, I mean, he again says that, like he says that in the European conservatives, they tried to conserve the old aristocratic order, and that's what sets American conservatives apart, because what they're trying to conserve is classical liberalism against these various perversions of the left, living constitution, and so forth. So yeah, at the end of the day, he's not claiming to be a different species. He's saying I'm what you liberals claim to be. That's what I really am, and you guys are a corrupted version of the true American liberalism. So yeah, I guess you're saying there's something subservient in his argument, and I kind of from the point of view of a certain conservative, I can see that.
So you write in this new essay that the last decade has exposed the deep psychological continuities between movement conservatism and the fascist tradition. Is that fair?
Yeah, I wouldn't say fascist tradition, because I don't want to, I recognize all the differences between Nazism, Italian fascism, but yeah, there is a certain, there are, again, you won't see these continuities if you accept Goldberg's definition of conservatism, just traditional values, classical liberalism. But if you see that, as you said, it is even this kind of traditional conservatism, which sought to fit in the court Jew as it were, there was still this powerful sense of grievance beneath these articulations of principles. And once you acknowledge that the grievance is really more central than the principles, then you'll see the continuities between the conservatism and the fascism.
Would you agree that if a social practice doesn't have evolutionary reproductive advantages, that it isn't what it says it is. It's, for example, if we're talking about universal philosophical principles, it's a status game rather than something else. That in the final analysis, we are animals and we are driven to reproduce and to get status and to get things that are yummy, such as power. And usually the philosophy and the politics that we articulate is a stepping stone to advance ourselves.
Sure. I mean, I guess it's like, the teenager who's maybe not a jock, but not a hopeless nerd, but realizes maybe he can get the girls if he picks up the guitar.
Right.
And knows how to play well. And so, he's driven to these heights of artistic creation by this, very basic urge. I think, probably maybe in everybody's psychology, there's something like that.
Right. If you're losing at a status game, then you point out it's a status game. If you're winning at a status game, you don't point out it's a status game. Rather, it's the pursuit of truth or some other universal good.
It's just how things are. It's just the truth of things. Yeah.
So this MAGA term is different because the coalition is different. I mean, you've got the Maha movement, which absolutely blows my mind. It's just Bobby Kennedy and company just strike me as bat crazy. But if they help Trump win the election, I guess I'm on board with the Maha movement. So, but you do see essentially a solid psychological architecture in conservatism that stays the same across time and just simply reveals its true nature under stress.
Yeah, I think we all reveal our true nature under stress. So yeah, that wouldn't be distinctive of conservatism, but I think that's fine. That sort of ultimately, conservatives, what they want is thicker, more robust than libertarian principles or anodyne, traditional morality. Some of them have an ethnic sense of identity. Maybe not all of them do, but it's certainly more exclusionary than what Goldberg would endorse. And I think that, I guess the article is arguing that, for a while, those aims could be, pursued through the post-war conservative formulation, but ultimately it didn't really capture what they really cared about. And the stress created by that gave rise to Trump.
Right. I favor states' rights when that furthers my political agenda, and I oppose states' rights when it undercuts my agenda. States' rights is so incredibly transactional. For example, the Trump administration is thinking about passing legislation to bar any state from making certain AI legislation. So Republicans have been highly transactional with regard to states' rights.
Right. Well, for sure. A lot of them before, it was always about states' rights. But now I see, Sean Hannity and others talking about the supremacy clause of the Constitution. Of course, they have no understanding what it means. It doesn't mean that anytime there's a conflict, the federal government necessarily wins out, but they interpret it that way. They're very upset about sanctuary cities, which is simply a city where the local and state police are not going to go out of their way to help federal agents, but it was actually conservatives who pioneered what are called in the law anti-commandeering principles. So in the 80s, there were gun control laws, and they were trying to force local sheriffs to enforce those federal laws, and the sheriffs refused, and it went up to the Supreme Court. And they held, obviously the sheriff cannot affirmatively obstruct the enforcement of federal law, but the state and its creations are not obligated to channel resources to help the federal government. The federal government is responsible for enforcing federal laws. And so that's what conservatives, when it was about that, they were very much for states' rights. But now we have the same thing going on with the sanctuary cities. They're just saying, like, you fine, enforce federal immigration law. We're not helping you. That is now being treated as some kind of obstruction. So, yeah, very, very opportunistic reasoning.
So in your new essay, you see grievance as evidence of fascist drift. I see grievance as a universal tactic. Is that a fair description?
Well, it is a universal tactic, but if it's the kind of grievance that can only be redressed, this is something that I've written since the last version I sent you, what if it's the kind of grievance that can only be redressed through fascism or something approximating fascism? So if your grievance is that, even though formally we're in a free society, the left have actually, in their sly, insidious ways, they've taken control of the universities, the media, law firms, foundations, et cetera, and that's unfair. That has to be rectified. If that's your grievance, if what you're calling for is the redistribution of cultural capital in America, well, how's that going to happen without these illiberal, arguably fascist measures? It's a kind of grievance which cannot be redressed without an authoritarian turn.
So do you see an essential conservatism, a conservative soul?
No, I don't want to say a soul. I know there are things that I write that maybe give that impression, which I should take a look at. I think we have certain kinds of dispositions that express themselves in different ways in different contexts. So, if you were to take, let's say, the white identitarian branch of conservatism, if you were to put them in their white utopia, they could conceivably be, very liberal in the sense of insisting on due process and freedom of speech. They could be kind of socialistic and willing to promote a high level of redistribution. So if you put them in a certain context, that you could see certain left-wing features becoming salient. Put them in a different context, and they're not going to be salient, and other things are going to be salient. So it's kind of like we're all blind men feeling the elephant, and there is a thing there, but we're only going to see certain parts of it under each set of conditions.
So is it fair to say that in your new essay that you take the prestige of anti-fascism and deploy it to secure a moral victory for one side of the cultural and political conflict?
Well, I don't think it secures a victory of the liberals over the right, broadly conceived. I do think it's a victory of liberalism over Goldberg's particular brand of conservatism, his particular self-understanding, his understanding of what conservatism is. I do think it is kind of victory, but it's narrower.
So another way of understanding the difference between conservative claims of cultural oppression and your new essay is that the author of Conservative Claims is an anthropologist of ideological combat, and the latest Rony Guldmann is a combatant in ideological combat.
Yeah, I agree. There's a certain engagement with its corresponding blind spots. It's a different style. Agreed. A different temperament. A different ethos.
So when I've got into strange areas, I've often engaged in too much charity for the new crowd that I'm investigating. And I'm wondering, do you think that perhaps aside from Jonah Goldberg, in your eagerness to do something revolutionary, did you possibly extend too much charity and empathy and undue respect for conservative claims of cultural oppression in your magnum opus?
Maybe. I mean, it serves a particular purpose. I agree. It's not a level of understanding that's tenable in actual political life. You're either going to be sympathetic to conservatives, or you're going to be very critical or wary, and you can't go through life with that degree of detachment. So I think the latest essay, it's even not that it doesn't have value, but it's not practicable in an undiluted form. So yeah, it's a different ethos.
So what role does AI play in your life?
I'm open to it. I've looked at some of the stuff you've generated, not as carefully as I still would like to, but it is when it comes to my work, it seems like it is coherent. We can at least give it that, maybe persuasive at times. I use it at work. And it's of when I'm trying to research the law. It's of limited value. It makes up a lot of stuff. It's somewhat more effective than a Google search, but I see it kind of as an enhanced Google search more than AI that I can rely on. Maybe that'll change. Maybe the bubble will pop. I don't know.
Yeah, Gemini 3 is just incredible. It's just the latest advance. It's now far and away the best. But here are some AI analyses of your memoir about your time at Stanford. It is best read as a case study in academic alienation rather than as a factual expose of Barbara Fried and Sam Bankman. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, insofar as the facts taken themselves are kind of banal, in the absence of the cultural expose, there aren't that many facts. I only had that many interactions with them, so I agree that it's best read. And I've had people tell me, whether your ultimate claims about the website and so forth are true. I don't really care at all about that. Whether it's true or false doesn't change the value of the book. And I take that as a compliment.
So here's some more from AI. Barbara Fried is presented as an intellectual opponent and a participant in subtle forms of exclusion. The author treats her less as a personal villain than as an avatar of liberal academia's blind spots. What do you think?
Yeah. I use her as a stand-in for something bigger than her. I hope fairly, maybe unfairly in certain ways, but yeah, I mean, I certainly try to distinguish her overall, character as it would be perceived by a reasonable Stanford law denizen, and the particular conflict which she had, with me. So yeah, that sounds reasonable too.
Yeah, so this is more from ChatGPT. The book is credible as memoir, but not as evidentiary indictment. Its value lies in showing how academia can enforce orthodoxy through informal pressure. The Star Chamber of Stanford is best approached as a cautionary tale about academic power structures, not a smoking gun about Sam Bankman-Fried's parents. What do you think?
Again, I agree. I mean, if you had to choose between the two approaches, if it was one of the two, then the AI is correct. That it is best interpreted, at that higher intellectual level. Again, I happen to think that factually, that it's rooted in the facts as well. I understand that's debatable, but yeah, precisely because it is debatable. the other features, the more philosophical features, should perhaps be more salient.
So I asked ChatGPT if your books, such as Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, justify your sacrifices of not showing obeisance to the people in power. And so ChatGPT says, yes, on his own terms, the book insists in the higher truth in conservative alienation, that the visceral sense of being excluded from liberal spaces is not just paranoia, it's rooted in structural dynamics of power, prestige, and cultural capital. So refusing to conform to the cool kids in power is the very proof of authenticity. The sacrifice, the alienation, the professional exclusion, the loss of institutional belonging might seem noble if one accepts his framing of liberalism as an oppressive clerisy. To those who reject that framing, his martyrdom looks self-chosen and quixotic. The book Conservative Claim provides a philosophical justification for his alienation. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the book acknowledges that ultimately, my preferred self-conception does depend on a particular view of the world. And if you dismiss all that, then it's certainly quixotic or self-indulgent, and that's why that's precisely why the book goes to such lengths to articulate my worldview so that my actions can be viewed in that context. So yes, that there is a connection there. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, once reading Conservative Claims, then I think any sacrifice is worth it to get this book. That was my reaction.
I would like to think so, and I would hope to persuade. I'm glad you thought so, and I'd hope to persuade more people of that. And I think that it's this article. Even though it is maybe one-dimensional in certain ways, I do reference hopefully it will lead people to be interested in the broader work, and so whatever limitations are in the article itself, might be overcome in what it leads people to. I hope. We'll see.
Okay. Anything that you'd like to discuss? Anything that I should ask you about that I haven't?
I think it's been quite comprehensive. I think you've covered all bases and more.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ronnie. Great to talk to you, man.
Good talking to you, Luke.
Take care, man. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.